They told her the assignment was impossible. "Morgan, you're wasting your time. That data is corrupted beyond recovery." 3 weeks later, she walked into the executive boardroom unannounced. She placed a single USB drive on the polished table. "Not only did I recover it, I found who deleted it. And why? Why didn't give her the assignment to succeed. They gave it to her to silence her. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you." Morgan Chen was a digital forensic specialist with a reputation that made her both respected and resented at Pinnacle Technologies. At 32, she had already solved more data recovery cases than analysts with twice her experience. Her colleagues called her the Archaeologist because she could dig through digital debris and reconstruct information everyone else had given up for lost. Her superiors, however, had a different nickname for her behind closed doors: the Auditor. Not because it was her official title, but because Morgan had an inconvenient habit of documenting everything she found, regardless of who it might implicate. In an industry where efficiency and client satisfaction often trumped thoroughness, Morgan's insistence on complete data integrity made her a complicated asset. She had once delayed a high-profile product launch by 3 weeks after discovering security vulnerabilities that everyone else had overlooked. The delay cost the company millions, but ultimately saved them from a catastrophic breach that would have cost them their reputation. The executive team publicly praised her diligence, while privately placing her on projects that kept her away from sensitive development areas. Morgan's workspace reflected her methodical nature. While her colleagues' desks overflowed with coffee cups and personal items, hers contained only what was necessary: 3 monitors arranged in perfect symmetry, a notebook with color-coded sections, and a small plant she had named Pascal, after the mathematician. Her systems were equally organized, with meticulous folder structures and naming conventions that allowed her to locate any file within seconds. "You document like you're preparing for a court case every time," her supervisor, Director Jameson, once told her during a performance review. "Not everything needs to be preserved for posterity, Morgan. Sometimes efficiency means knowing what to let go." Morgan had simply nodded and continued documenting anyway. In her experience, the information others considered disposable often contained the very clues needed to solve the most challenging cases. She kept her own private backups of all her work, encrypted and stored in multiple locations. It wasn't paranoia, she reasoned, just professional thoroughness. The morning that changed everything began with unusual tension in the forensics department. Morgan noticed it immediately upon swiping her access card. The normal morning chatter among the analysts was replaced with hushed conversations that stopped abruptly when she approached. Her team lead, Vince Saunders, avoided eye contact when she greeted him, mumbling something about a busy schedule before hurrying into a conference room. By mid-morning, the situation became clear when Director Jameson called her into his office. His usual confident demeanor seemed strained, and he didn't offer his customary invitation to sit. "Morgan, we have a situation that requires immediate attention," he said, sliding a folder across his desk. "The Arcturus project data repository has experienced a catastrophic failure. The entire database is corrupted, and we need you to attempt recovery." Morgan knew the Arcturus project well by reputation, though she had never been assigned to it. It was Pinnacle's most prestigious government contract, a cybersecurity infrastructure development worth billions. The project was led by 3 senior executives: Chief Technology Officer Robert Vega, VP of Government Relations Diane Mercer, and Director of Special Projects Harrison Wells. "What happened to the backups?" Morgan asked, already scanning the preliminary incident report. "There should be at least 3 redundant systems." Jameson's expression tightened. "That's the problem. All backup systems failed simultaneously. The primary database and all backups were corrupted in the same event." We believe it may have been a sophisticated attack, but we can't confirm without the original data. Morgan's instincts immediately flagged several inconsistencies. Multiple redundant systems failing simultaneously was virtually impossible without deliberate intervention. This wasn't a typical recovery case. It had all the hallmarks of internal sabotage. When did this happen? She asked, noting the incident. Report lacked a specific timestamp. Approximately 72 hours ago, Jameson replied, his tone clipped. We've had our best people working on it since then, no success. That was another red flag. If the failure had occurred 3 days ago, why was she only being informed now? As the company's top data recovery specialist, she should have been called immediately. I'll need full access to all systems, Morgan said. Server logs, access records, everything. And I'll need to interview everyone who had access to the database in the week before the failure. Jameson shifted uncomfortably. That won't be possible. This is highly classified. You'll work with what's in the folder and the corrupted database. Copies we provide. No server access, no interviews. The executives are concerned about potential leaks if we widen the investigation. Now Morgan was certain something was wrong. No legitimate recovery effort would be hamstrung from the start with such severe restrictions. Someone wanted this to fail. With those limitations, recovery chances are minimal, she stated flatly. We understand, Jameson replied, not meeting. Her eyes, just do your best. You have 2 weeks. If you can't recover the data by then, we'll have to inform the client that it's been permanently lost. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. As she left Jameson's office, Morgan noticed an email notification appearing on his computer screen. She caught only a fragment of the subject line before the door closed. Chen assignment. Confirmation of. That evening, Morgan worked late, reviewing what little information she had been provided. The corrupted database files showed signs of deliberate manipulation rather than accidental corruption. Certain patterns in the damage were too precise, too targeted to be random. Someone had specifically destroyed key sections of the database while leaving others untouched. As she was preparing to leave, she noticed Vince Saunders returning to the office. It was unusual for him to work this late. More unusual was his furtive behavior, constantly glancing over his shoulder as he made his way to the server room. Morgan waited until he left, then checked the access logs for the floor using her security clearance. Vince had spent exactly 7 minutes in the server room, but there was no record of any maintenance ticket or scheduled work. Morgan made a decision that night. If she was going to solve this case, she couldn't play by the restrictive rules they had imposed. Someone had gone to great lengths to destroy this data, and now they were setting her up to fail at recovering it. There was only one logical conclusion. Someone powerful wanted this information to stay buried, and they expected Morgan to be their unwitting accomplice by declaring it unrecoverable. The next morning, she began what appeared to be a standard recovery attempt, running conventional tools that would show up in the system logs. But beneath this visible effort, Morgan initiated her real investigation. She installed a discrete packet sniffer on her workstation to monitor network traffic, looking for any unusual data transfers. She also began reconstructing the company's internal network architecture from memory, identifying potential access points to the servers she had been explicitly forbidden from examining. By the end of the first week, Morgan had made her first breakthrough. Hidden within the corrupted files was a pattern she recognized. The damage wasn't random. It targeted specific types of records. Financial transactions, resource allocations, and communications with specific external vendors had been systematically erased. More telling was what remained intact: performance metrics, technical specifications, and public-facing documentation. Someone had wanted to maintain the appearance of a functional project while eliminating any trace of how resources were actually being used. Morgan worked through the weekend, sleeping on the small couch in the break room rather than going home. By Sunday night, she had recovered approximately 18% of the corrupted data, enough to confirm her suspicions, but not enough to build a case. She needed more, and she was running out of time. The breakthrough came from an unexpected source. While reviewing the recovered fragments, Morgan noticed recurring references to an external storage location identified only as Frost. It wasn't any official Pinnacle server or cloud storage solution she was familiar with. On a hunch, she cross-referenced the term with employee directories and found that Frost was the maiden name of Diane Mercer, the VP of Government Relations. Working through layers of encryption and misdirection, Morgan discovered that Frost was a private server maintained outside Pinnacle's network, but regularly accessed by high-level executives. It contained mirrored copies of the supposedly lost Arcturus data, but with significant modifications. Financial records had been altered, resource allocations changed, and performance metrics inflated. The pattern was clear. The Arcturus project had become a black hole for company resources, absorbing far more funding than was being reported to shareholders or the government client. Millions of dollars had been diverted to shell companies that, with further investigation, Morgan traced back to offshore accounts connected to 3 executives: Vega, Mercer, and Wells. The corruption of the database hadn't been an attack or an accident, it had been a cover-up. When an internal audit had been scheduled, someone had deliberately destroyed the evidence of their embezzlement. And now Morgan had been assigned the impossible task of recovery because they believed she would fail, giving them justification to declare the data permanently lost. But they had underestimated her skills and her determination. By the beginning of the second week, Morgan had not only recovered significant portions of the original database, but had also gathered evidence of the systematic fraud that had been taking place. The question now was what to do with this information. Going to Director Jameson was out of the question. His behavior suggested he was either involved or aware of the situation. The same applied to anyone in the direct management chain. Morgan needed to take this higher, but doing so would require irrefutable evidence that could stand up to the inevitable denial and counter-accusations. She spent the next 3 days building her case, creating a comprehensive timeline of the fraud, documenting the money trail through the shell companies, and preserving evidence of the deliberate database corruption. She compiled everything into an encrypted file, created multiple backups, and prepared a presentation that even a non-technical executive would understand. On the morning she was scheduled to deliver her recovery results, Morgan arrived early. Instead of going to the forensics department, she went directly to the office of Eleanor Wright, Pinnacle's chief compliance officer, a former federal prosecutor known for her uncompromising integrity. "I need 10 minutes of your time," Morgan said without preamble. "What I'm about to show you involves criminal fraud by members of the executive team." Wright studied her for a long moment, then nodded. "Close the door." Morgan presented her findings concisely, showing clear evidence of the embezzlement scheme, the deliberate destruction of evidence, and the attempts to prevent recovery. Wright's expression remained impassive, but her rapid note-taking indicated she understood the severity of the situation. "How many people know about this?" Wright asked when Morgan finished. "Just me, as far as I know, and now you." Wright picked up her phone. "Cancel my meetings for the day. And contact legal and security. No details over email or text." She looked back at Morgan. "You were supposed to present your recovery results this morning?" Morgan nodded. "To Director Jameson and the project executives at 10 a.m. "You'll keep that appointment," Wright said. "But you won't be going alone." The meeting room was tense when Morgan arrived. Director Jameson sat with Vega, Mercer, and Wells, all wearing expressions of polite anticipation that Morgan now recognized as masked concern. They expected her to report failure, giving them the excuse they needed to officially write off the lost data. "Before we begin," Morgan said, connecting her laptop to the projector, "I should mention that I've invited some additional participants." The door opened, and Eleanor Wright entered, accompanied by 2 members of the corporate security team and Pinnacle's general counsel. The executives exchanged alarmed glances. "What is this?" Vega demanded. "This is a classified project meeting. These people don't have clearance." "Actually," Wright replied coolly, "as Chief Compliance Officer, I have universal clearance for any internal investigation. Ms. Chen, please proceed with your presentation." For the next 30 minutes, Morgan methodically laid out everything she had discovered: the embezzlement scheme, the falsified reports to government clients, the deliberate destruction of evidence, and most damning of all, the recovered communications between Vega, Mercer, and Wells discussing how to handle anyone who might discover their activities. "This is absurd," Mercer sputtered when Morgan finished. "She was assigned to recover corrupted data, not conduct some amateur investigation. None of this would be admissible in any proceeding." "That's where you're wrong," the general counsel sighed quietly. "Ms. Chen followed established company protocols for reporting suspected fraud. The evidence she's gathered is more than sufficient for internal action, and likely for criminal charges as well." Within hours, Vega, Mercer, and Wells were escorted from the building. Their company accounts were suspended, their access revoked. By the end of the day, Pinnacle had issued a statement announcing an internal investigation into potential irregularities in the Arcturus project and the immediate suspension of 3 executives, pending the outcome. In the days that followed, the full extent of the fraud became clear. Nearly $40 million had been diverted over 3 years. The government client had been systematically misled about project progress and capabilities, and at least 2 other employees who had raised concerns had been strategically sidelined or terminated. Morgan expected to be celebrated as the person who had uncovered the largest fraud in company history. Instead, she found herself in a strange limbo. Officially, she received a commendation and a substantial bonus. Unofficially, she became something of a pariah among certain levels of management. She had broken the unspoken rule: don't look too closely at what happens at the executive level. 2 weeks after the executives were removed, Morgan was called to a meeting with the newly appointed interim CTO, a veteran engineer named Marcus Donovan, who had been brought out of retirement to stabilize the company. "I'll be direct, Ms. Chen," Donovan said after they were seated. "You've put us in a complicated position. What you did was absolutely right from an ethical standpoint, and you saved this company from what could have been a catastrophic government investigation. But you've also made a lot of people nervous. Because they're worried about what else I might find?" Morgan asked. Donovan smiled slightly. "Precisely. People with secrets tend to get nervous around someone with your particular talents and ethical compass. I've been asked to offer you several options for your future here." The options were predictable: a significant promotion with a substantial salary increase, but a transfer to a division far from sensitive data; a generous severance package if she preferred to leave; or continuation in her current role with the understanding that she would be under greater supervision. "There's a 4th option I'd like to propose," Morgan said. "One that would benefit both the company and its culture." Her proposal was bold: the creation of a new department focused on internal data integrity and fraud prevention. REPORTING directly to the Chief Compliance Officer rather than through the technology chain of command. The department would have broad authority to audit systems and processes throughout the company, ensuring that what happened with Arcturus could never happen again. "You want to institutionalize what you did accidentally," Donovan observed. "I want to create a system where doing the right thing isn't the hard choice," Morgan replied. "Where documentation and transparency are valued rather than discouraged." To her surprise, Donovan agreed to present the proposal to the board. 3 weeks later, Morgan was appointed as the first director of data integrity and ethics, with a team of 6 specialists selected for both their technical skills and their reputations for thoroughness. Their first project was a comprehensive review of all major government contracts, ensuring that what had happened with Arcturus was an isolated incident rather than a systemic problem. Their findings led to additional personnel changes and a complete restructuring of how project finances were tracked and reported. In the months that followed, Morgan's department became both respected and feared within Pinnacle. Respected by those who valued integrity, feared by those with something to hide. When her team began a review, employees knew that nothing would be overlooked, no irregularity dismissed, no corner unexamined. The criminal cases against Vega, Mercer, and Wells proceeded slowly through the justice system, with all 3 eventually pleading guilty to reduce charges to avoid lengthy trials. The financial penalties were severe, with most of their personal assets seized or forfeited. More lasting was the professional impact, their careers and reputations destroyed by their own greed and the persistence of the analysts they had underestimated. 1 year after the Arcturus incident, Morgan was invited to speak at an industry conference on corporate ethics and technology. Her session, originally scheduled for a small breakout room, was moved to the main hall due to unexpected demand. "They gave me an impossible assignment," she told the packed audience. "Not because they wanted me to succeed, but because they expected me to fail. They counted on my declaration of defeat to cover their tracks. What they didn't understand was that I don't see impossible assignments as burdens. I see them as invitations to look deeper, to question assumptions, and to find paths that others have overlooked." Her message resonated beyond the immediate audience. Video of her speech circulated widely within the technology community, and her framework for data integrity auditing became a model adopted by other companies seeking to strengthen their internal controls. At Pinnacle, Morgan's department expanded, eventually growing to 20 specialists working across all divisions of the company. The culture shift was gradual but unmistakable. Documentation became valued rather than avoided. Thoroughness was recognized as a strength rather than an inconvenience. Most importantly, employees at all levels began to understand that integrity wasn't just a corporate value to be printed on posters, but a practical approach that protected both the company and its people. Morgan never sought publicity for what she had done. She declined book deals and speaking tours, preferring to focus on building systems that would outlast any individual. But her influence spread through the industry as her team members eventually moved to other companies, bringing her methodologies and standards with them. The corrupted database that had been meant to end her career instead became the foundation for a new approach to corporate accountability. The executives who had tried to use her as a convenient scapegoat had inadvertently created the very system that would have prevented their fraud from the beginning. 3 years after the Arcturus incident, Morgan received an email from a forensics analyst at another company, someone she had never met. "I was facing pressure to sign off on a database without proper verification," the message read. "I remembered your story and decided to do the complete analysis anyway. What I found prevented a potentially catastrophic security breach. Thank you for showing that doing the right thing isn't just morally correct, it's professionally necessary." Morgan printed that email and framed it, placing it on her office wall as a reminder of why documentation matters, why thoroughness isn't just personal perfectionism, and why some rules are worth breaking when integrity is at stake. In conference rooms and training sessions across the industry, Morgan's approach became known as the Chen method. Document everything, question inconsistencies, follow the evidence wherever it leads, and never accept impossible assignments at face value. Her legacy wasn't built on a single heroic moment, but on the countless daily decisions to prioritize truth over convenience, Accuracy over expediency and integrity over advancement. The assignment designed to end her career had instead defined it, transforming a skilled analyst into a symbol of professional courage that would inspire a generation of technology professionals to stand firm when facing their own impossible choices. The assignment had seemed straightforward enough at first glance. Review the financial models for the Helios acquisition, the email from CFO Lawrence Hayes had read. We need fresh eyes before the board presentation next week. But as Morgan began examining the spreadsheets, inconsistencies emerged like fault lines beneath an apparently solid surface. Revenue projections that defied industry trends. Growth assumptions that contradicted market research. Expense allocations that vanished into vaguely labeled categories. Morgan documented each discrepancy methodically, creating a parallel analysis that revealed a disturbing pattern. The Helios acquisition wasn't the strategic expansion being presented to the board. It was a financial shell game designed to hide Pinnacle's growing liquidity problems while enriching certain executives through obscured compensation structures. This isn't right, she told herself, staring at her screens late into the evening. The office had emptied hours ago, leaving her alone with the damning numbers and a decision that would define her next steps at Pinnacle. The ethical choice was clear, but the professional consequences were equally obvious. Challenging a CFO approved financial model days before a major board presentation would not be received well, especially when that challenge came from someone outside the financial division. Morgan had been building her data integrity and ethics department for 6 months. Now, they had made progress implementing new verification protocols and transparency requirements across several divisions. But they remained vulnerable, their authority still questioned by those who saw them as unnecessary oversight rather than essential protection. She picked up her phone, hesitated, then called Eleanor Wright, the chief compliance officer who had supported her through the Arcturus incident. It's never simple with you, is it, Chen? Wright said after hearing Morgan's findings. Send me your analysis. I'll review it tonight and we'll meet first thing tomorrow. The meeting the next morning included Wright, interim CTO Marcus Donovan, and General Counsel Patricia Winters. Morgan presented her findings methodically, showing how the financial models had been systematically manipulated to present Helios as a much more valuable acquisition than reality supported. The board would be making a decision based on fundamentally flawed information, Morgan concluded. And these compensation structures hidden in the subsidiary arrangements would direct approximately $28 million to 3 executives over 4 years, completely outside normal oversight channels. One of those executives being Lawrence Hayes, Wright noted, examining the documents. Who conveniently assigned you this review? Why would he do that? Winters asked. If these models are as manipulated as you claim, why risk having someone like Morgan examine them? Because he didn't expect me to find anything, Morgan replied. This review assignment came with explicit limitations. I was only supposed to check the mathematical accuracy of the formulas, not verify the underlying assumptions or cross-reference with market data. He was creating a paper trail, Donovan realized. If questions arose later, he could point to your review as evidence of due diligence. Exactly, Morgan said. My name would be attached to this, making me complicit or at least negligent when the true figures eventually emerged. The room fell silent as the implications settled. Hayes was a founding executive of Pinnacle, with deep connections throughout the company and the industry. Challenging him would be significantly more difficult than exposing the Arcturus fraud had been. We need more, Winters said finally. This analysis shows discrepancies, but Hayes could claim these are simply different projections based on internal data you don't have access to. We need documentary evidence of deliberate manipulation. I might have that, Morgan said, pulling up another file. When I realized what I was seeing, I began tracing revision histories on all the financial models. I found earlier versions that show a progressive manipulation of key variables, always trending toward making the acquisition look more favorable. And I found this. She displayed an email chain that had been buried deep in the file metadata, apparently attached inadvertently when the files were converted between formats. In it, Hayes discussed with Helios's CFO how to adjust the models to support our narrative and structure the compensation to avoid trigger and disclosure requirements. That's the smoking gun, Wright said quietly. But it's also evidence that this goes beyond Pinnacle. The Helios executives are complicit, which means we're not just dealing with internal fraud, Winters added. This potentially involves securities violations, investor deception, and conspiracy charges that could affect both companies. The decision they reached was painfully clear. They needed more time to build a comprehensive case before confronting Hayes, which meant the board presentation had to proceed as scheduled. Morgan would have to allow her name to be associated with the review, at least temporarily, while they gathered additional evidence. I don't like it, Morgan objected. The board will make decisions based on fraudulent information. We'll delay the actual acquisition, Donovan assured her. There are dozens of technical and regulatory reviews that can legitimately take months. That gives us time to build an ironclad case. Reluctantly, Morgan agreed to the plan. For the next week, she maintained a careful facade of routine work while secretly expanding her investigation. She identified 2 additional executives involved in the scheme, documented systematic alterations to financial projections, and uncovered a complex network of shell companies that would have channeled acquisition funds back to key participants. The board meeting proceeded as scheduled. Morgan watched from a distance as Hayes delivered a polished presentation on the strategic benefits of acquiring Helios. The board approved moving forward with due diligence and integration planning, exactly as Hayes had intended. What they didn't know was that their approval had just given Morgan's team access to even more Helios data, further strengthening the case against the conspirators. 3 weeks into the expanded investigation, disaster struck. Morgan arrived at work to find her access credentials revoked. When she called security to report the apparent system error, she was informed that her services were no longer required at Pinnacle. No explanation, no exit interview, just immediate termination. She tried calling Wright, Donovan, and Winters, but none responded. Their administrative assistants all delivered the same message. They were unavailable and would not be returning her calls. It was as if a steel door had slammed shut, cutting her off from everything she had built. By midday, the situation became clearer when she received a terse email from Human Resources. She was being terminated for unauthorized access to confidential information and violation of data security protocols. The email referenced a supposed late-night intrusion into restricted financial systems that had been traced to her credentials. The setup was obvious but effective. Hayes had discovered their investigation and moved decisively to discredit her before she could present her findings. By framing her as a rogue employee accessing systems without authorization, he had undermined her credibility and cut her off from the evidence she had gathered. Morgan's home felt strange that afternoon, the unfamiliar silence of a weekday stretching around her as she paced her living room, considering her options. Her first instinct was to contact journalists, to blow the whistle publicly before Hayes could complete his plan. But without access to the evidence she had collected, her accusations would be easy to dismiss as the bitter claims of a terminated employee. As evening approached, her doorbell rang unexpectedly. She opened it to find Marcus Donovan standing there, looking grim. "We don't have much time," he said, stepping inside and closing the door. "Hayes moved faster than we anticipated. He's convinced the board that you were attempting corporate espionage, possibly selling information to competitors." "That's ridiculous," Morgan protested. "Where are Wright and Winters? Why haven't they spoken up?" Wright has been placed on administrative leave pending an investigation into her failure to properly supervise your department. Winters is being cautious, trying to determine how much Hayes knows and who on the board might still be receptive to the truth. Donovan handed her a small encrypted drive. I managed to secure copies of some of your evidence before they locked down your systems. It's not everything, but it's enough to establish a pattern. What am I supposed to do with this? Morgan asked. I've been fired and publicly accused of corporate espionage. No one will listen to me now. Not inside Pinnacle, no, Donovan agreed. But Hayes made one critical mistake. In his haste to discredit you internally, he didn't consider external authorities. Understanding dawned. The sake, Morgan said. Securities fraud falls under their jurisdiction. Exactly, Donovan confirmed. Hayes can control the narrative inside Pinnacle, but he can't stop a federal investigation once it begins. The challenge will be presenting enough evidence to convince them to look deeper without access to the complete data set. They spent the next 3 hours organizing what evidence they had, creating a coherent narrative of the fraud scheme that could be understood by non-technical investigators. The resulting document was comprehensive but incomplete, showing clear patterns of deception but missing key connections that had existed in the full data set. It's not perfect, Morgan acknowledged, reviewing their work, but it should be enough to raise serious questions. It has to be, Donovan said grimly. Because Hayes is moving quickly, the acquisition timeline has been accelerated. They're pushing for preliminary agreements by the end of next week. After Donovan left, Morgan spent a sleepless night weighing her options. Going to the SIC was the obvious choice, but federal investigations moved slowly, and Hayes had positioned himself to complete the fraudulent acquisition before any official action could stop it. She needed something that would create immediate pressure, forcing Pinnacle and Helios to pause their plans while authorities investigated. The answer came to her just before dawn. The SEC might move slowly, but investors reacted instantly to credible allegations of fraud. If she could present her evidence in a forum where Hayes couldn't control the narrative, the market pressure alone might force the board to delay the acquisition. Morgan spent the next day preparing her approach, distilling complex financial manipulations into clear, understandable examples that demonstrated unmistakable intent to deceive. By evening, she had a presentation even a non-financial audience could follow, showing how the Helios acquisition had been systematically misrepresented to shareholders and the board. The quarterly earnings call was scheduled for the following afternoon. These investor calls typically followed a scripted format. Executives presented results, provided updates on strategic initiatives, and then took carefully screened questions from major institutional investors. But Morgan knew that the call service Pinnacle used allowed any shareholder to join the queue for questions. All she needed was a single share of Pinnacle stock to gain access. By noon the next day, Morgan owned exactly 1 share of Pinnacle Technologies, purchased through an online brokerage account. She registered for the earnings call under her own name, calculating that Hayes wouldn't expect such a direct approach and wouldn't be monitoring the question queue personally. The call proceeded predictably for the first 40 minutes. CEO Catherine Bennett delivered prepared remarks about quarterly performance, followed by Hayes presenting financial highlights. When they reached the question and answer portion, Morgan's heart raced as she waited in the digital queue, watching the names ahead of her dwindle as each investor asked their questions. Our next question comes from Morgan Chen, individual investor, the moderator announced. There was a brief pause, then Bennett's voice, slightly uncertain. Go ahead, Miss Chen. Thank you for taking my question, Morgan began, her voice steady despite her racing pulse. I'd like to ask about the financial models being used for the Helios acquisition. Specifically, the revenue growth assumptions that project a 32% increase in the first year, despite Helios's actual performance, showing declining revenue for 3 consecutive quarters. The silence that followed was deafening. Morgan could almost visualize the panicked looks being exchanged in the conference room. "I'm not sure where you're getting those figures," Hayes finally responded, his tone forcefully casual. "The acquisition models are based on comprehensive due diligence that supports strong growth potential. I'm referring to the models presented to the board last week," Morgan continued, "which show projected revenue growth that contradicts both market trends and Helios's own internal forecasts from 2 months ago. I'm also curious about the $28 million in executive compensation, hidden in subsidiary arrangements that wasn't disclosed in the presentation materials." The line went silent again, longer this time. When Bennett's voice returned, it was tight with controlled tension. "We appreciate your question, but this call isn't the appropriate forum for discussing confidential internal projections. We'll be happy to address any concerns through proper investor relations channels. Operator, next question please." But the damage was done. Within minutes, financial news sites were reporting on the contentious exchange during Pinnacle's earnings call, with headlines questioning the transparency of the Helios acquisition. By market close, Pinnacle stock had dropped 7%, and analysts were calling for clarification on the acquisition terms. That evening, Morgan received a call from an unknown number. It was Eleanor Wright. "That was either the bravest or most reckless thing I've ever witnessed," Wright said without preamble. "Hayes is apoplectic. The board chair has called an emergency session for tomorrow morning. Several major investors have demanded immediate clarification on the acquisition financials." "Is it enough to stop them?" Morgan asked. "It's enough to slow them down," Wright replied. "The board has ordered Hayes to provide complete financial models for independent review." "But Morgan, you need to be careful. Hayes isn't just trying to discredit you professionally anymore. He's talking about pursuing criminal charges for corporate espionage and securities manipulation." The threat wasn't unexpected, but it still sent a chill through Morgan. Corporate executives rarely face serious consequences for financial manipulation, but a former employee making public accusations could easily become a target for retaliation. "What about the SEC filing?" she asked. "Did Donovan submit our evidence?" "This morning," Wright confirmed. "But federal investigations take time, and Hayes has powerful allies. You've created a delay, but we still need more to stop this completely." The next day brought a flurry of developments. Financial media outlets were running special reports on the Helios acquisition, with analysts questioning the discrepancies. Morgan had highlighted. Pinnacle issued a statement announcing a thorough review of acquisition projections, while maintaining that all financial models were sound. Most significantly, 2 major institutional investors publicly stated they would oppose the acquisition unless independent verification of the financial models was provided. Morgan watched these developments from the relative safety of her apartment, weighing her next move. She had created enough pressure to force a pause, but Hayes was a seasoned executive who had navigated corporate crises before. Given time, he might find ways to salvage his plan while continuing to target her personally. The opportunity to strike decisively came from an unexpected source. A junior financial analyst from Helios contacted her through an anonymous email, offering internal documents that confirmed everything Morgan had discovered and more. The analyst had been troubled by the manipulated projections, but had feared retaliation if they spoke up internally. With this new evidence, Morgan now had a complete picture of the fraud scheme from both sides of the acquisition. The manipulation was even more extensive than she had initially uncovered, with Helios executives actively participating in creating false projections to inflate their company's value while securing personal financial benefits through the hidden compensation structures. Morgan arranged a secure meeting with the Helios analyst, where they compiled a comprehensive dossier of evidence. This time, Morgan didn't go to the SEC alone. She contacted the attorneys general in both states where The companies were headquartered, providing them with the complete evidence package simultaneously. The response was swift and devastating. Within 48 hours, both companies received official notices of investigation. Trading in both stocks was temporarily suspended. And most damaging of all, search warrants were executed at both corporate headquarters, with financial records and executive communications seized as evidence. Hayes attempted a final desperate maneuver, calling an emergency press conference where he denounced Morgan as a disgruntled former employee who had accessed confidential information illegally and was now spreading false allegations. His performance might have been convincing had it not been interrupted by breaking news that two Helios executives had already agreed to cooperate with investigators in exchange for reduced charges. The Helios acquisition collapsed spectacularly. Both companies' stocks plummeted when trading resumed. The Pinnacle board, facing shareholder outrage and regulatory scrutiny, voted to place Hayes on administrative leave pending the investigation. Results: within a week, both he and two other Pinnacle executives involved in the scheme had resigned to pursue other opportunities, a transparent attempt to distance themselves from the growing scandal. For Morgan, vindication came at a high professional cost. Despite being proven right, she had become a controversial figure in corporate circles, viewed as either a courageous whistleblower or a dangerous liability, depending on one's perspective. Job offers that had begun appearing after news of her role broke tended to come from companies specifically seeking to establish stronger ethical compliance, rather than mainstream technology firms. The legal aftermath unfolded over months. Hayes and four other executives from both companies eventually faced federal charges for securities fraud, wire fraud, and conspiracy. Most accepted plea agreements to avoid lengthy trials, resulting in fines, disgorgement of profits, and in Hayes's case, a 2-year prison sentence. 3 months after the Helios scandal, Morgan sat in a small coffee shop across from Catherine Bennett, the CEO who had presided over Pinnacle during both the Arcturus fraud and the failed Helios acquisition. Bennett had resigned 2 weeks after. Hayes, accepting responsibility for the governance failures that had allowed such schemes to develop under her leadership. Now, away from corporate politics and media scrutiny, she had requested this private meeting with the woman who had brought down 2 major corporate conspiracies. "I underestimated you twice," Bennett admitted, her voice carrying none of the authoritative confidence that had once defined her public persona. "Not just your technical abilities, but your resolve. I keep asking myself how things might have been different if I'd listened to you from the beginning." Morgan studied the former executive, noting the subtle signs of stress that expensive clothing and careful makeup couldn't quite conceal. "Why did you want to meet?" she asked directly. "2 reasons, Bennett replied. "First, to apologize. I was the CEO. The culture that made both situations possible developed under my leadership, even if I wasn't directly involved in the fraud." Morgan nodded, accepting the apology without comment. "And the second reason?" "I'm joining the board of Meridian Systems," Bennett said, naming a mid-sized technology company known for innovative medical software. "They're implementing new governance and ethics frameworks after their own scandal last year. I recommended they consult with you on building those systems." Morgan's surprise must have shown on her face because Bennett smiled slightly. "Yes, I'm recommending the woman who effectively ended my career at Pinnacle. Because both times you were right, and both times the company would have been better off if they'd listened to you instead of trying to silence you." The meeting with Meridian's executive team took place the following week. Unlike her experience at Pinnacle, where she had built her integrity department while fighting resistance at every level, Meridian's leadership had already recognized their vulnerability to ethical breaches. The previous year's scandal, involving privacy violations in their patient data systems, had cost them millions in settlements and incalculable damage to their reputation. "We need more than just compliance checkboxes," explained Meridian's CEO, Dr. Sarah Winters. We need systems that actually prevent problems before they develop, not just documentation that covers us legally after the fact. Over the next 6 weeks, Morgan worked with Meridian to develop a comprehensive framework that integrated data integrity, ethical review, and transparent governance throughout their organization. Unlike traditional compliance departments that operated as separate entities, often viewed as obstacles by operational teams, Morgan's approach embedded integrity protocols directly into development and business processes. Think of it as quality assurance for ethics, she explained during a presentation to Meridian's full leadership team. Just as you wouldn't ship a product without testing for functional defects, you shouldn't advance business initiatives without testing for ethical vulnerabilities. The Meridian contract proved to be just the beginning. As news of Morgan's work spread through industry channels, other companies began reaching out. Some had experienced their own scandals and were desperate to rebuild trust. Others recognized their vulnerability to the same issues that had plagued Pinnacle and wanted to implement preventative measures before problems emerged. 6 months after leaving Pinnacle, Morgan founded Integrity Systems Consulting with a team of 5 specialists, each bringing different expertise: financial analysis, software development, corporate governance, cybersecurity, and legal compliance. Their client list grew steadily, primarily through word-of-mouth referrals from executives who recognized the value of proactive ethical frameworks. Not everyone welcomed their approach. At TechCore Industries, a senior vice president openly challenged Morgan during her initial presentation. "This all sounds impressive," he said dismissively, "but isn't this just adding bureaucracy that slows down innovation? We're in a competitive industry. We don't have time for endless reviews and documentation." Morgan had encountered this objection often enough to have a ready response. "Let me ask you something. How much time did Pinnacle lose dealing with the Arcturus fraud? How much market value did they lose when the Helios acquisition collapsed? How many talented employees left during the subsequent reorganization?" The room fell silent as her point registered. The cost of ethical failures far outweighed the efficiency gains from cutting corners. "Integrity isn't the opposite of innovation," Morgan continued. "It's the foundation that makes sustainable innovation possible. Without it, you're building on quicksand." The most meaningful validation of Morgan's approach came not from client contracts or industry recognition, but from the people who reached out privately to share their experiences. Junior analysts who had observed questionable practices but hadn't known how to address them. Mid-level managers who had been pressured to approve dubious transactions. Technical specialists who had identified security vulnerabilities only to have their concerns dismissed as excessive caution. "Your story gave me courage," one software engineer wrote. "When I found a privacy vulnerability in our main product, management wanted to classify it as a low-priority issue that could be addressed in a future update. I stood my ground and insisted it needed immediate attention, citing your experience at Pinnacle as president. They listened." These messages reinforced Morgan's conviction that creating systems for ethical business wasn't just about preventing fraud or legal violations. It was about empowering people throughout organizations to act with integrity without sacrificing their careers. 18 months after founding her consultancy, Morgan was approached with an unexpected opportunity. The new leadership at Pinnacle Technologies, still rebuilding from the dual scandals that had decimated their executive ranks and damaged their market position, wanted to bring her back as Chief Integrity Officer, a newly created C-suite position, with direct reporting to the board of directors. The offer was financially generous and came with substantial authority, including veto power over major business decisions that raised ethical concerns. It represented a complete vindication of, quote, everything Morgan had fought for during her time at Pinnacle. The movement she had sparked was becoming self-sustaining, embedded in organizational cultures rather than dependent on individual champions. At an industry recognition dinner where she received an award for her contributions to business ethics, Morgan reflected on the journey that had begun with that first impossible assignment at Pinnacle. "They gave me an assignment designed to make me fail," she told the audience. "They expected me to either miss the fraud entirely or to see it and remain silent. Instead, I chose a third path, one that wasn't on their menu of acceptable options. I chose to see clearly and speak honestly, regardless of the professional consequences." She looked out at the room filled with technology leaders, many of whom had implemented her integrity frameworks in their own organizations. "What I've learned through this journey is that integrity isn't just about personal character. It's about creating systems where ethical choices are recognized and rewarded, where transparency is valued over convenient opacity, and where long-term sustainability matters more than quarterly results. Most importantly," she continued, "I've learned that change doesn't require perfect heroes or dramatic confrontations. It requires ordinary professionals making the daily choice to question inconsistencies, document discrepancies, and stand firm when pressured to compromise their standards. It requires creating environments where those professionals are supported rather than isolated." The standing ovation that followed wasn't just for Morgan, but for the movement she represented. A movement that was transforming how the technology industry approached ethics and integrity, not as compliance burdens, but as essential foundations for sustainable innovation and growth. The assignment that had been meant to silence her had instead amplified her voice. The attempt to make her complicit in fraud had instead launched a career dedicated to preventing such fraud. The executives who had tried to use her as a convenient scapegoat had unwittingly created their most effective adversary. Morgan's legacy extended far beyond the specific frauds she had exposed or even the consulting practice she had built. It lived in the countless professionals who approached their work with renewed commitment to integrity, in the organizational systems that supported ethical decision-making, and in an industry that was slowly learning that true innovation required ethical foundation. The worst assignment had become her greatest opportunity, not just to advance her own career, but to create lasting change in an industry that touched billions of lives through its products and services. The careers her work had destroyed were replaced by countless careers built on more sustainable foundations, guided by the principles of integrated integrity that she had championed. In corporate boardrooms, university classrooms, and technology development teams around the world, Morgan's influence continued to grow, reminding everyone that integrity wasn't just a personal virtue, but a professional responsibility that required both individual courage and systematic support. The impossible assignment had become a powerful catalyst for necessary change. The invitation arrived on embossed cardstock, the kind of formal communication that had become increasingly rare in the digital age. "The National Technology Ethics Commission requests the honor of your presence at our inaugural conference," it read. Keynote address, Morgan Chen, founder of Integrated Integrity Frameworks. 7 years had passed since Morgan had walked out of Pinnacle Technologies for the last time, carrying only her personal belongings and the certainty that she had done what was right. Now sitting in her office at the university, where she divided her time between consulting and teaching, the invitation represented a remarkable culmination of her journey. The commission itself was something Morgan could hardly have imagined. When she first confronted corruption at Pinnacle, a bipartisan initiative established by congressional mandate, it brought together industry leaders, academic experts, and public advocates to develop ethical standards for an increasingly technology-dependent society. That they had chosen her to deliver the keynote address spoke volumes about how far the conversation around tech ethics had evolved. "Professor Chen?" Her assistant's voice interrupted her thoughts. "Your 2 o'clock is here." "The student group from the ethics leadership program." Morgan smiled, setting aside the invitation. The formal recognition was gratifying, But these meetings with students represented something more meaningful. The next generation of technology professionals who would carry forward the principles she had fought to establish. The 6 students who filed into her office were in their final year of the Technology Ethics Leadership Program Morgan had helped create. Selected from hundreds of applicants, they had spent the past year learning not just abstract ethical theories, but practical frameworks for implementing integrity systems in complex organizations. "I've reviewed your capstone proposals," Morgan began once they were seated. "Each of you has identified a significant ethical challenge in technology and developed a systematic approach to addressing it. I'm impressed with your work." She turned to a young woman whose quiet determination reminded Morgan of herself at a similar age. "Sophia, your framework for algorithmic accountability in criminal justice applications addresses a critical gap in current governance models. Have you considered how it might be implemented in systems that are already operational?" The discussion that followed was exactly what Morgan had hoped to foster when she helped establish the program. Thoughtful, nuanced exploration of complex, ethical challenges that went beyond simple compliance to address fundamental questions of justice, transparency, and human impact. When the meeting concluded, one student lingered behind. Marcus Rodriguez, whose project focused on ethical frameworks for emerging biotechnology applications, seemed hesitant to leave. "Something on your mind, Marcus?" Morgan asked. "I've been offered a position at Zenith Biotech," he said. "The compensation is excellent, and the technical challenges are fascinating. But I've heard concerns about their data practices, particularly regarding genetic information collected from their consumer testing services." Morgan recognized the dilemma immediately. It was one she had encountered repeatedly in her work. Promising young professionals torn between career advancement and ethical concerns. The easy answer would be to advise him to decline the offer and seek employment at a company with a stronger ethical reputation. But Morgan had learned that change often required engagement rather than avoidance. "What would you hope to accomplish if you accepted the position?" she asked instead. Marcus's expression shifted as he considered the question. "Their technical capabilities are extraordinary, but their governance systems are underdeveloped. I believe I could help implement stronger protections for user data while advancing their legitimate research objectives." Morgan nodded. "The most significant ethical advances often come from professionals who choose to engage with imperfect systems rather than avoid them. The question isn't whether Zenith has challenges, but whether you'll have the authority and support to address them effectively." She shared strategies for assessing organizational readiness for ethical improvement and for building internal coalitions to support necessary changes. The conversation wasn't about simple answers, but about developing the judgment to navigate complex situations with integrity. After Marcus left, Morgan returned to the invitation on her desk, thinking about what message would be most valuable for the inaugural commission conference. The temptation would be to focus on her personal journey, the dramatic confrontations at Pinnacle that had launched her career in ethics. But she had come to believe that those extraordinary circumstances, while compelling as narrative, were less instructive than the quieter, everyday choices that shaped ethical cultures. The weeks leading up to the conference were filled with preparation, not just for her keynote, but for a series of workshops she would lead on implementing integrity systems in various technology domains. Morgan insisted that these sessions be practical rather than philosophical, giving participants concrete tools they could apply in their organizations immediately. When the conference finally arrived, Morgan was struck by its scale and diversity. Technology executives mingled with academic researchers, government officials, and public advocates. Former adversaries engaged in thoughtful dialogue about shared challenges. It represented a significant evolution in how the industry approached ethics, moving from defensive compliance to proactive engagement. The commission chair, Dr. Eliana Washington, introduced Morgan with words that reflected how far the conversation had come. our keynote speaker isn't just an expert in technology ethics. She's someone who demonstrated extraordinary courage at a time when such courage carried significant personal and professional risks. More importantly, she translated that individual courage into systematic approaches that have helped countless organizations build integrity into their operational DNA. As Morgan approached the podium, she looked out at the audience of over 2,000 attendees. Among them were faces she recognized, former colleagues from Pinnacle, clients from her consulting practice, students she had mentored, and even a few of the executives whose careers had been destroyed by the frauds she had exposed. "Thank you, Dr. Washington, for that generous introduction," Morgan began. "I'm honored to address this inaugural gathering of the National Technology Ethics Commission, an institution that represents how far we've come in recognizing that technological advancement and ethical considerations must develop in tandem rather than in opposition." She paused, setting aside her prepared remarks for a moment of candor. "Many of you know me primarily through the more dramatic chapters of my professional journey, the Arcturus and Helios incidents at Pinnacle Technologies. Those events certainly shaped my path and raised important questions about corporate accountability. But I've come to believe that focusing too much on those extraordinary circumstances can actually undermine our broader mission." The audience grew attentive, sensing this wasn't a standard keynote. When we elevate whistleblowing and public confrontation as the primary mechanisms for ethical correction, we implicitly accept a narrative of individual heroism against systemic corruption. That narrative, while sometimes necessary, fails to acknowledge a more important truth. Ethical cultures are built through thousands of small decisions made by ordinary professionals who never make headlines. Morgan shared examples from her consulting work: the software engineer who insisted on additional privacy protections despite timeline pressure, the financial analyst who questioned revenue projections that seemed disconnected from market realities, the product manager who delayed a launch to address accessibility issues that weren't legally required but ethically necessary. These individuals weren't facing dramatic conspiracies or criminal fraud, she explained. They were navigating the everyday tensions between efficiency and thoroughness, between immediate results and long-term sustainability. Their actions didn't destroy careers or generate media coverage, but collectively, they shaped organizational cultures where integrity became operational rather than aspirational. Morgan then outlined what she had come to see as the three foundational principles of sustainable ethical practice in technology. First, integrity must be systematic rather than heroic. We can't rely on exceptional individuals making extraordinary sacrifices. We need processes, incentives, and governance structures that make ethical choices the path of least resistance rather than the road of greatest courage. Second, ethical considerations must be integrated rather than segregated. When we treat ethics as a specialized function, separate from core business and technical operations, we create artificial conflicts between values and objectives. True integration means that ethical assessment becomes as fundamental to product development as technical feasibility or market analysis. Third, accountability must be constructive rather than punitive. While consequences for intentional misconduct remain essential, most ethical challenges emerge from systemic pressures rather than malicious intent. Our focus should be on creating environments where concerns can be raised early, addressed transparently, and resolved collaboratively. Throughout her address, Morgan grounded abstract principles in concrete practices, providing frameworks that organizations could implement regardless of their size or sector. She challenged the audience to move beyond compliance-focused approaches, to develop what she called ethical muscle memory, the organizational capacity to recognize and address ethical implications instinctively rather than reactively. As she concluded, Morgan returned to the personal reflection that had begun her remarks. "My career was launched through confrontation, through saying no when others wanted me to say yes. That kind of courage will always be necessary in certain circumstances. But the future we're building together requires something more sustainable than individual defiance. It requires collaborative creation of systems where integrity is built into the foundation rather than added as an afterthought. The standing ovation that followed wasn't just professional courtesy. It represented genuine recognition that Morgan had articulated something essential about the evolution of technology ethics, a shift from reactive crisis management to proactive cultural development. The conference continued for 3 days with Morgan leading workshops, participating in panel discussions, and meeting individually with organizational leaders seeking guidance on implementing integrity frameworks. Throughout these interactions, she emphasized practical application over abstract theory, helping participants develop specific strategies tailored to their unique challenges. On the final evening, Morgan found herself sharing dinner with an unexpected companion, Catherine Bennett, the former Pinnacle CEO who had reached out to her after resigning in the wake of the Helios scandal. Bennett had rebuilt her career as an advocate for corporate governance reform, serving on several boards and advising companies on ethical leadership development. "I've been following your work," Bennett said as they waited for their meal. "You've accomplished something remarkable, Morgan. You've changed how an entire industry thinks about ethics." Morgan shook her head slightly. "That gives me too much credit. The change has come from countless professionals making better choices in their daily work." "True," Bennett acknowledged. "But you gave them the frameworks and the language to make those choices effectively. More importantly, you helped shift the narrative away from ethics as a constraint to ethics as a foundation for sustainable innovation." Their conversation continued, touching on the challenges still facing the technology sector and the progress that had been made. Despite their complicated history, they found common ground in their shared commitment to building more ethical technological futures. As the conference concluded, Commission Chair Dr. Washington announced an initiative that caught Morgan by surprise: the establishment of the Chen Fellowship for Ethical Innovation, a program that would place emerging technology leaders and organizations committed to developing and implementing strong integrity frameworks. This fellowship honors not just Morgan Chun's personal courage, Washington explained, but her vision of ethics as a collaborative, constructive force in technological development. Fellows will work at the intersection of technical innovation and ethical governance, helping to ensure that the technologies shaping our future reflect our highest values rather than our lowest expedience. The announcement moved Morgan deeply, not because it recognized her personally, but because it institutionalized the approach she had championed, embedding ethical considerations directly into innovation processes rather than treating them as external constraints. In the months following the conference, Morgan divided her time between teaching, consulting, and helping to establish the fellowship program. The inaugural class of Chen Fellows included professionals from diverse backgrounds, each committed to bridging the gap between technical expertise and ethical implementation. During a mentoring session with the fellows, Morgan reflected on the journey that had brought her to this point. "When I confronted that first impossible assignment at Pinnacle, I wasn't thinking about launching a movement or creating a new approach to technology ethics. I was simply doing what seemed necessary in that specific situation, documenting discrepancies, questioning inconsistencies, and ultimately refusing to be complicit in fraud." She looked around at the fellows, seeing in them the future she had been working to create. "What I've learned since then is that integrity isn't just about dramatic stands against clear wrongdoing. It's about the painstaking work of building systems where ethical considerations are woven into every decision, where transparency is valued over expediency, and where long-term sustainability outweighs short-term convenience." One fellow, a cybersecurity specialist named Raj Kumar, raised a question that cut to the heart of the challenge. How do you maintain that commitment when the pressure to compromise is intense? When meeting quarterly targets or beating competitors to market? seems to depend on cutting ethical corners? Morgan appreciated the directness of the question. That pressure is real, and pretending otherwise doesn't help anyone. What I've found most effective is reframing the timeframe of evaluation. Short-term thinking creates false conflicts between ethics and performance. Longer-term perspective reveals that ethical shortcuts ultimately undermine sustainable success. She shared examples from her consulting work, companies that had rushed products to market despite known ethical issues, only to face devastating backlash when those issues inevitably emerged. Organizations that had manipulated performance metrics for immediate advantage, only to discover that the resulting misallocations created long-term inefficiencies. The most valuable lesson I've learned, Morgan continued, is that integrity isn't just a moral imperative. It's a practical necessity for sustainable innovation. When we build on foundations of deception or manipulation, we create structures that will eventually collapse under their own contradictions. As the fellowship program developed, Morgan found herself increasingly drawn to the educational aspects of her work. While consulting allowed her to help individual organizations implement better systems, teaching and mentoring offered the opportunity to shape how the next generation of technology leaders approached ethical questions from the outset. 10 years after leaving Pinnacle, Morgan made the decision to focus primarily on education, accepting a full-time position as Professor of Technology Ethics and Organizational Integrity at a leading university. Her course on integrated integrity became one of the most sought after in the technology management program, with students often applying specifically to work with her. The educational approach she developed differed significantly from traditional ethics courses. Rather than focusing exclusively on philosophical frameworks or case studies of spectacular failures, Morgan created immersive scenarios that required students to navigate the subtle, everyday ethical challenges that defined most professional experiences. Major scandals make headlines, she would tell her students, but ethical cultures are built or undermined through thousands of small decisions that never make the news. How you respond when asked to accelerate testing to meet a deadline. Whether you document potential concerns, even when addressing them might delay a product launch. If you speak up when diversity considerations are overlooked in algorithm development. Her classroom became known for its rigorous but supportive environment, where students learn to recognize ethical dimensions in seemingly technical decisions and to develop practical strategies for addressing concerns effectively. Guest speakers from industry shared real-world experiences, emphasizing that ethical leadership wasn't an abstract ideal, but a practical necessity in modern technology development. When Morgan received the university's Distinguished Teaching Award in her third year, the student nomination highlighted what made her approach unique. Professor Chen doesn't just teach us ethics as a separate subject. She shows us how ethical considerations are inseparable from technical excellence and business success. Most importantly, she gives us practical tools to navigate complex situations with integrity, even when the path isn't clear or easy. Impossible assignment that had once threatened to derail Morgan's career had instead set her on a path that transformed not just her own professional trajectory, but the way an entire industry approached ethical governance. The executives who had intended to make her complicit in their fraud had unwittingly created their most effective adversary, not as an external critic, but as the architect of systems that made such fraud increasingly difficult to perpetrate. 15 years after the Arcturus incident, at a retirement ceremony for Eleanor Wright, the former Pinnacle Chief Compliance Officer who had supported Morgan through both major confrontations, Morgan reflected on the legacy of those challenging times. When I think about what we were facing then, and where the industry has come since, I'm reminded that progress rarely follows a straight line, she told the gathered colleagues and friends. The systems that seemed impenetrable, the executives who appeared untouchable, the practices that were accepted as inevitable, all proved more vulnerable to change than anyone expected. Wright, who had gone on to become a leading advocate for corporate governance reform, smiled at the assessment. And that change came not primarily through regulation or external pressure, but through the collective actions of professionals who decided that integrity wasn't negotiable. Morgan nodded. That's the most important lesson I've carried forward in my work. Lasting change doesn't depend on extraordinary heroes making dramatic stands. It comes from ordinary professionals, making the daily choice to document thoroughly, question inconsistencies, and stand firm when pressured to compromise their standards. She looked around at the gathering, which included people at various stages of their careers, from seasoned executives to early career professionals, just beginning to navigate the complexities of organizational life. The worst assignment I ever received became the greatest opportunity of my career, not because it launched me into prominence, but because it taught me that integrity isn't just a personal virtue. It's a professional responsibility we owe to everyone who depends on our expertise and honesty. As Morgan concluded her remarks, she reflected silently on the full circle her journey had taken. The analyst who had once been assigned an impossible task specifically designed for failure had transformed that challenge into a catalyst for industry-wide change. The careers her work had destroyed were now far outnumbered by the careers built on the ethical foundations she had helped establish. The assignment meant to silence her had amplified her voice. The attempt to make her complicit had instead launched a movement for accountability. The executives who had seen her as a convenient scapegoat had unwittingly created a legacy of integrity that would outlast their schemes and shape technological development for generations to come. In classrooms, boardrooms, and development teams around the world, Morgan's influence continued to grow through the professionals she had taught, the organizations she had advised, and the framework she had created. The impossible assignment had become a powerful testament to how integrity, systematically applied, could transform not just individual careers, but entire industries. The worst assignment had revealed her greatest strength, and in doing so, it had changed everything. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.